This sound was the first one I developed in my initial sound design session, but I was using a different sample initially and swapped later for this fluty sample. But I didn't really change much from what you see in that beat making video. I'm using a neighbor track to get some extra effects movement, a comb filter to add some resonance, some delay and reverb, and a bit of compression to smooth things out, because this track gets pretty nasty and spiky with all the weird processing that's happening, especially the comb filter, which has a tendency to produce pretty nasty transients. The odd relationship between the sample playback track and the neighbor track P-locks adds nice movement to a rather simple basic pattern. But the real magic with this sound happens on the scenes, where I get to play the sound a bit, transposing the sample pitch and sometimes the comb filter frequency as well. This general technique of mapping various pitch transpositions to scenes is something I like to use if it works for a particular track, and it's what allowed me to play some of the melodies that pop up in the A section. The part I used for the B section doesn't have quite as much pitch transposition stored in the scenes, and those scenes are primarily textural and rhythmic, although they do shift the pitches around a bit here and there. As you can see, these scenes also change parameters on many of the other tracks, and for a given pitch, I often have more than one texture available. Notice that the sample playback track has been slowed down on the second part. I was able to accomplish what I wanted with this sound using only eighth notes, so I opted to slow the track down instead of using 2 bars at 16th note resolution. I always prefer to use less pattern pages and steps for a particular sound, if it makes sense to do so. Here's how this primary sound gets affected by the scenes in the third and fourth patterns, which are associated with the second part. Relatively few pitch changes on these scenes, but plenty of comb filtering. Up next, we have the bass track, which also uses a neighbor machine and a similar cross-rhythmic processing pattern. Since I put a phaser on this track, it messed with the phase of the low end quite a bit, and I felt the need to massage the stereo field of the final mix in post-production to reduce some of the phase cancellation issues. This trash sample is also particularly nasty in and of itself. You can see the waveform clipping right there. I did not do any stereo adjustment for the audio I recorded for this footage. Other than swapping the sample for the A section and putting some modulation on the start point of the sample, not much changed on the bass track from the original beat making session. Just a lot of gentle massage and then scene tweaks so the bass would fit with other things depending on what I wanted that scene to accomplish. Mostly it's just getting filtered or affected in different ways to emphasize different aspects or add little variations. I didn't map any pitch transposition to it. I also put some fill tricks on this track for some of the patterns, so I could dynamically increase or decrease the density of the bass notes during my performance. One thing on this bass part that adds a bit of extra interest on some of the scenes is that it engages an LFO mapped to the sample rate reduction of the lo-fi effect. I think it's easy to forget about mapping LFO speed and depth to the crossfader, but it's really quite amazing what possibilities it offers. On the drum track, I didn't deviate much from the very first 2-bar pattern I developed. Mainly I added in fill trigs and some conditional trigs for variations on some of the patterns, and I also changed the sample locks around. There are a lot of small individual tweaks to many of the trigs in each pattern to produce different beats and textures, all built on the same 2-bar foundational drum pattern. Changing the sample locks and filter settings per trig has a big impact. In terms of processing on the drum sounds, it's primarily just a filter and compression, with a bit of pitch change sprinkled in, particularly on some of the scenes. Combining pitch, filter, and retriggering control can produce fun variations with percussive samples. Note that grid recording mode and latched fill mode don't play well together, which is unfortunate. Here are some of the sample locks and filter settings for those locks. I'm also moving the sample volumes around quite a bit on a per trig basis. Between the different patterns, I'm mainly changing the auxiliary sounds, although a couple times I change up the clap and snare sounds as well. These scenes here are set up for glitchy variations on the percussion track using different retrigger amounts and retriggering times, as well as repitching the samples a bit and moving the filter around. In this footage, I'm not trying to time my pattern changes, so maybe you've noticed this already, but I kept the pattern quantization setting at its minimum value for this particular performance. I usually prefer to have the most direct control possible over pattern changes, even if it comes at the cost of making some mistakes. Also, the way this particular track's pieces fit together, and the way I perform it, I desire direct and immediate control over the relationship between performance phrasing and section changes. The phrase length that I produce through my performance is often fairly fluid, and I want the ability to dynamically change the master length of the patterns, so to speak. Track 6 is a chord stab, which changes to a minor pad sample on the second part. Just some typical amplitude envelope, filter, and delay processing. The sample really does most of the work. This track is also cross-rhythmic with a length of 24 steps. Like most of my tracks, there's a bit of sneaky modulation, in this case on the amplitude envelope and the filter frequency. You can see here in the percussion track I have some sneaky filter modulation as well. As you can see, the default amplitude envelope has a very short hold and release time. This chord track gets transposed around and filtered a number of different ways depending on what scene we're on. There are also some patterns that contain fill trigs for this sound. You've probably noticed quite some clicks in a lot of what I'm doing. That's because I'm kind of cavalier about where I restart sample playback. This sound has some modulation on the start time, as well as the filter on this part. My approach here was purposefully harmonically adventurous, and this next channel is actually just another chord sample on part 1. I used to listen to a lot of jazz, and my choices on this production, I think, were strongly informed by those sensibilities. Once I had the basic raw sequences, fitting together these different parts that all have quite a bit of harmonic information was a focus of my scene development and more subtle later stage sound design and mixing decisions. Jamming on all these possibilities was when the track really started to take shape for me and feel more complete. When I start to feel I have enough options for a performance, I don't want to delay by going backwards and developing more raw material. I want to focus on capturing a good presentation of the ideas that I already have. The Starfall sample that track 7 uses on the second part is very fun also, as I have an LFO on the start of this sample to produce further variations. This approach combines very nicely with using scenes to transpose the sample. On the master track, I'm running a compressor for the first effect, adding a bit of gain in a parallel compression setup, with the RMS value set to maximum. The second effect on the master track is a delay, which is set up for beat repeat effects in conjunction with the delay control mode. Click the card that just popped up and it will take you to a video where I discuss a bit of details on how to set it up the way I have it here. The second part's master track is set up very similarly, just with slightly different parameter settings. Now that we are listening to the whole mix instead of just individual parts, I'd like to discuss some of the ways I think about scenes and how I tend to organize them. Generally, scene 16, all the way on the right, I configure as a breakdown or reduction scene, where one or more tracks gets heavily filtered or reduced in volume. There are usually other transformations that go along with this, but the primary purpose is to change the mix by taking away or reducing elements. Typically, I will have one or more of these scenes grouped on the right-hand side of the Octatrack. Often, I also like to have a more extreme breakdown scene that actually cuts the volume parameter of all tracks to -64 and tweaks a bunch of the reverbs and delays, so there is a sort of pause wash available that can be used in many different ways, most often as a transitional device. Along with the reduction scenes that I generally group on the right-hand side, I also like to have some intensification or fill scenes to work with. Usually I place these just to the left of the reduction scenes. These particular fill scenes on this track often control a wide variety of parameters, but notably a few of them re-pitch and re-trigger the percussion track. If I am setting up a series of scenes as a pitch transposition keyboard, I will often start by grouping them on the left side, although when I take this approach, it's not uncommon for various pitches to be scattered around quite a bit on different scenes. In this project, I organized it so the pitch transposition scenes on the left-hand side contain less parameter changes overall, whereas the scenes on the right-hand side tend to have more parameter changes that affect more tracks in more dramatic ways. You may notice this scene on part 2 is separate from the other scenes, and it's because no other scenes are similar enough to the effect that it has, and I wanted to make sure it was easy for me to distinguish during performance. You'll notice that I tend to enable and disable the Scene A button, and I tend to associate it with the scenes on the far left. I tend to leave the Scene B button always activated, and I prefer to leave it on a breakdown scene rather than a fill scene, just in case I forget what I'm doing later on. Similarly, even though I've left some scenes blank, partially for visual organization, I do not switch an active scene slot to a blank scene, and prefer to deactivate a scene slot to know with certainty I'm hearing the default state of the part. I'm pretty flexible overall, but I do try to follow some conventions just so I don't end up confusing myself. Part of what gives this track its rhythmic feel is a bit of slightly different swing values on some of the tracks. Some of the tracks aren't swung at all, though. And also on the percussion track, a few of the key trigs are slightly micro-timed.